Fox News Alert now, we have new comments from President Trump on the ceasefire in Iran. The president telling NBC News in a brand new interview that he was very optimistic a peace deal with Iran was within reach and that Iran's leaders talk much differently when you're at a meeting than they do to the press. They're much more reasonable. President Trump also saying that if Iran does not make a deal, quote, it's going to be very painful.
Getting a lot of reports. They've been meeting for many hours, as you probably have noticed. We'll see what happens. Look, regardless, we win. Regardless what happens, we win. We've totally defeated that country. And so let's see what happens. Maybe they make a deal, maybe they don't. From the standpoint of America, we win. One other thing that's happening is that boats are sailing up and heading out to our country. Big, beautiful tankers, and we're loading them up with oil and gas and everything else. And it's a pretty beautiful thing to see. Beautiful thing.
Trump came out of Islamabad wanting the world to believe one simple story. America had moved the process forward. Iran had been brought to the table, and peace was still within reach. But that is not what the facts show. Because before the talks in Pakistan, Washington had already put forward a 15-point ceasefire proposal that Iran rejected as excessive and maximalist. Iran then answered with its own 10-point framework, and U.S. reporting later indicated that Washington treated that Iranian framework as a workable basis for talks. Yet once the delegations arrived in Islamabad, the U.S. still pushed demands that sounded far closer to its earlier maximalist position than to the spirit of Iran's package. The result was predictable. No deal, only a pause, and a region still on edge. And that is only the surface contradiction. Because one of the most important parts of Iran's proposal was not about uranium or paperwork. It was about the wider war theater. Tehran's position, as reported, was that a meaningful ceasefire could not be isolated to Iran, while Israeli attacks continued against Iran's allies and regional axis, especially in Lebanon. That Lebanon component mattered because Iran was not treating the war as separate compartments. It was treating it as one connected battlefield. But even after Washington publicly moved toward Iran's 10-point framework, Israeli operations in Lebanon continued. So the first question is not whether America accepted Iran's proposal. Which parts did it actually honor? That is the real scandal. Because if one side offers a package and the other side publicly accepts it but quietly treats it like a menu, then what is being negotiated is not peace. What is being negotiated is optics. And that is exactly what Islamabad exposed. The United States wanted the headline of diplomatic progress without fully paying the political cost of constraining Israel. Iran wanted a broader ceasefire logic that included Lebanon's and the wider anti-Iran theater. Washington wanted a narrower process that kept the U.S.-Iran track alive, while avoiding a direct confrontation with the Israeli agenda. Those two things are not the same, and pretending they are the same is what collapsed trust before the ink could even dry. This is why Islamabad matters far beyond one failed meeting. Because the talks did not fail simply because America and Iran disagree. America and Iran have disagreed for decades. The talks failed because the two sides were operating with fundamentally different definitions of what a ceasefire even is. For Iran, the ceasefire was a package. If attacks continue in Lebanon, if Allied forces remain exposed, if the regional battlefield keeps burning, then there is no meaningful truce. For Washington, the ceasefire appears to have been treated more like a menu. Some items are urgent, some are flexible, and some can be quietly deferred while the press is told that diplomacy is alive. That is not a minor technical difference. That is the difference between a ceasefire meant to transform the battlefield and a ceasefire meant to manage headlines. And once you understand that, the rest of the picture becomes clearer. The United States first came with a 15-point proposal. Iran rejected it as maximalist. That already told you something. Washington entered the moment expecting to dictate terms. Iran then countered with 10 points, which were reportedly considered workable by Trump's side. But if those 10 points were truly workable, why did the talks still collapse after more than 20 hours? Why did American officials still describe Iran as not sufficiently committing on the nuclear issue? Why did Iranian officials still say the US demands were excessive? The answer is simple. Washington wanted the legitimacy of accepting Iran's framework without fully surrendering control over the content of the negotiations. This is the pattern the Global South recognizes immediately. One side is told, "We accepted your terms," but then the implementation on the ground tells a different story. One side is told, "Come to the table in good faith," but the violence of the stronger ally continues. One side is told, "This is a peace process," but the enforcement of peace remains selective. That is not neutral mediation. That is power management. And power management is exactly what Washington was trying to do in Islamabad. Let's be even more direct. If the US really accepted the Iranian 10-point proposal as the basis for talks, and one of its key elements was the inclusion of Lebanon in the ceasefire logic, then the continued Israeli operations in Lebanon mean one of two things. Either Washington accepted a framework it never intended to enforce, or Washington lacks either the will or the ability to restrain Israel, even when its own diplomatic credibility depends on it. Neither explanation helps the American case. In the first scenario, America is acting in bad faith. In the second, America is not the real manager of the process it claims to lead. Either way, credibility suffers. And this is where the liberation lens reading matters. Because too many analyses stop at, "The talks failed." That is not enough. The real issue is why the talks failed, and what that failure reveals about the structure of US power in the region. Washington still wants to play the role of indispensable mediator. It still wants to present itself as the actor that can move Iran, manage Israel, steady the Gulf, calm markets, and keep global shipping lanes open. But Islamabad exposed a central contradiction in that self-image. The US wants to manage regional order while refusing to seriously restrain the client state that keeps setting the region on fire. That contradiction is not new. But in Islamabad, it became impossible to hide. And this matters even more because the talks happened in Pakistan, not Washington, not Geneva, not Vienna. Pakistan became the stage because neutral ground was needed, because direct trust was too weak, and because the region itself had become the arena in which the great powers could no longer pretend this was a distant diplomatic exercise. Islamabad symbolized emergency diplomacy. It symbolized a situation so serious that both sides needed a politically workable venue just to sit in the same building. But even that neutral venue was not enough to overcome the deeper imbalance. Because a venue can host negotiations, it cannot manufacture trust. And trust is exactly what Washington has been depleting. First, by treating ceasefire logic selectively. Second, by publicly presenting progress in terms that overstate what the other side has actually accepted. Third, by allowing the battlefield to undermine the diplomacy in real time. That is why the talks in Islamabad were fragile from the beginning. And once you see that fragility, you also see why this story is bigger than America and Iran. It is about what mediation means when one mediator is also the chief patron of one belligerent. It is about whether international diplomacy can survive when ceasefire proposals are accepted in public but violated in practice. And it is about the wider message sent to the Global South. If even in a moment of near war, if even in a venue as symbolically urgent as Islamabad, the US still cannot or will not impose restraint on Israel while claiming to lead peace, then what exactly is American mediation worth? That question is now hanging over the region. And it is hanging over American credibility globally. Because when Washington says, "We accepted Iran's framework, but Lebanon still burns," the world hears something very different. It hears, "We accept your proposal, except for the parts that inconvenience our side." That is not diplomacy. That is hierarchy disguised as negotiation. And that hierarchy is why these talks were always about more than the nuclear issue. Yes, the nuclear file was central. US officials said Iran did not clearly commit enough. Iran said U.S. demands remained unrealistic and excessive. But the nuclear file was only one layer. Underneath it were the real post-war questions: sanctions relief, frozen assets, the Strait of Hormuz, regional deterrence, war responsibility, and the broader architecture of who sets the terms of order in the Middle East after this round of confrontation. America arrived in Islamabad not just to discuss peace, but to shape the post-war map in its own favor. Iran arrived not just to avoid escalation, but to prevent that map from being written over its allies, its deterrence network, and its regional standing. That is why there was no easy deal to be had. And that is also why the public discourse around the talks has been so distorted. You will hear, especially in Western coverage, that America made a good faith final offer and Iran refused to move. You will hear that Iran overreached. You will hear that the process stalled because Tehran would not make the necessary commitments. But a liberation lens reading forces a harder question. How can one talk about Iranian intransigence while ignoring that one of Iran's core conditions, Lebanon, was never meaningfully respected on the ground? How can Washington claim the mantle of mediator while permitting or failing to stop continued Israeli operations during the very diplomatic opening? It wants the world to celebrate? How can America ask for trust while delivering selective compliance? Those are not rhetorical flourishes. Those are the real questions. And they lead to an even deeper conclusion. The U.S. did not just fail to secure a ceasefire deal in Islamabad. It demonstrated the limits of empire-managed diplomacy. Empire-managed diplomacy works like this. The empire defines the framework. The empire decides which conditions are serious and which are negotiable. The empire protects its ally from full accountability. And then the empire presents the process as a fair search for peace. But the countries on the receiving end of that system are not blind. Iran is not blind. Lebanon is not blind. The wider global south is not blind. They can see when acceptance is partial, when compliance is selective, and when mediation is simply another method of controlling the script. So where does this leave the ceasefire? It leaves it thin, unstable, and vulnerable to collapse. Because a ceasefire that is not backed by a symmetrical enforcement is not really a ceasefire. It is a temporary pause for one side and continued exposure for the other. And that is why Islamabad ended without a deal. Not because diplomacy was impossible, but because Washington was trying to sell peace in installments while the other side was asking for a real package. What should we watch next? Watch Lebanon. Because if Lebanon remains exposed, then you already know the broader truce logic is still broken. Watch whether Washington shifts from headline management to real pressure on Israel. If it does not, then the same contradiction will kill the next round too. Watch whether Iran keeps treating the regional battlefield as one connected theater. That will determine whether any future talks remain package-based. Watch the Gulf and shipping lanes, especially the Strait of Hormuz, because unresolved maritime and sanctions questions can turn a failed ceasefire into an energy crisis very quickly. And watch Pakistan's diplomatic role. Islamabad was not incidental. It may become important again if both sides still want a channel, but no longer trust any Western venue enough to use it. The bottom line is this. America did not simply fail to get a deal in Islamabad. America exposed the contradiction at the heart of its Middle East diplomacy. It wants to lead peace without restraining its ally. It wants to accept a framework without honoring all of it. It wants the legitimacy of mediation without the neutrality mediation requires. And once the world sees that contradiction clearly, every future American peace initiative begins at a disadvantage. Because now the question is no longer, can Washington broker a deal? The question is, why should anyone trust Washington's definition of a deal in the first place? That is the real legacy of Islamabad. This is Liberation Lens.